Caribbean
Thank you, Ren, for your insights and your reading. Today I'm going to do a reading from an essay that, well, let me just introduce myself. My name is Sharmyn Cruz, and I'm a curator and writer that lives in Rotterdam, Netherlands. But I lived in Chicago for about 8 years, and I have a lot of love for Chicago. Thank you, Eduardo, Rosario, for inviting me to read today and raise funds for the Chicago Freedom School, an amazing organization that is doing really caring and nurturing work in Chicago. So yeah, today I'm going to be reading an essay that was commissioned by the Monday Journal, and Monday Journal comes out of the Jacob Lawrence Gallery at the University of Washington. This particular edition was edited by Danny Giles, and Danny approached me to write an essay that could reflect and think about systems of representation and visibility in relationship to whiteness. The essay is titled A Polyrhythmic Ensemble, Fugitive Multitudes Underway. This beautiful edition was designed by the wonderful design team in Chicago, Summer, and was edited by the amazing curator at the Jacob Lawrence Gallery, Emily Zimmerman. All right, I'm gonna start reading this essay, which I wrote this last spring, winter-spring. A polyrhythmic ensemble, fugitive multitudes on their way. They sound Puerto Rican, I said to my boyfriend, referring to two people walking about 50 feet behind us. It was a quiet winter night on an ominous street, the kind that gives you the chill on the outskirts of Amsterdam. We were walking home from the train station, and I couldn't actually hear what they were saying or if they were even speaking in Spanish for that matter, but they sounded Puerto Rican to me, a Boricua. That moment of recognition was accompanied by a spatial and cognitive dissonance that knocked me out of my temporality and made me unable to connect the sound vibrations coming from their direction, our current European landing. With our current European landing, sorry. This uncanny feeling drove me to think about the network of relations in the Caribbean and how they manifest not only within the physical archipelago, but far away from it. This dislocation unfurls from a maritime culture that came to be through a violent and cataclysmic amalgamation of civilizations. In a place exploded for its advantageous geographical position in the defense and support of La Encomienda, the plantation system, and the transatlantic trade. The Caribbean argues for connection because and despite of its colonial history. Allergies are really bad right now. Sorry. The Caribbean argues for connection because and despite of its colonial history, and its cultural cornucopia reaches far and wide through the diasporic movement, not only of people, but of its cultural imaginary. Its exuberance and inventiveness and cacophonic ways are felt up against whiteness, and it remains fugitive, unable to become transparent for the sake of Western canon, its binaries, and categorizations. The proliferation of this Caribbeanness cannot be oriented unlike bodies because it is boundless and centerless, a net that is continuously expanding and retrieving. In a recent talk at the University of Maryland's Drescher Center for the Humanities, Puerto Rican writer Mayra Santos Febres describes what she calls the fractal Caribbean as a place where history is not linear and neither is the construction of the self. Interconnection is the fulcrum of Caribbean thought and expression. Santos Febres, like many other Caribbean writers, is influenced by Antonio Benitez Rojo's book, The Repeating Island, in which he uses fractal mathematics and chaos theory to talk about the Caribbean net, arguing that the Caribbean reticularity is constitutive of the production of thought that positions itself outside of Western binaries in spite of its contestation with binarism. She goes on to explain that unlike binary thought, in Caribbean thought, the relationship, I'm quoting her here, the relationship between opposites functions through a dynamic in which contradiction is not the only exclusive value that propels movement, social organization, and artistic expression. End of quote. Writers such as Antonio Benitez Rojo and Eduardo Glissant also argue that Caribbean thought falls outside of the rationality, dogmas, and methods that serve Western societies. For Santos Febres, this is exemplified in el uno múltiple in Santería, an arrangement of binary languages that behave in variation. The self in Santería is considered a network of relations and a manifestation of natural forces that interact with life. In fact, the birth of Santería, or Regla de Oshá, is gestated through the forces of amalgamation that conjugate in the Caribbean, as the practice is, I'm quoting here Aisha Belizos de Jesus, and in the book that she wrote, Electric Santería, a really great book. She says, Santería is Yoruba-inspired, African-imagined, diasporic religion that emerged in Cuba through the transnational practices of slavery, imperialism, and colonialism since the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it's a growing religion practiced throughout the world. End of quote. Santería is perhaps one of the most significant manifestations and examples of the potency of relations that take place within the Caribbean, informing a production of meaning that is reticular and imperceptible in the dance, music, clothing, gestures, food, literature, and oral traditions of the archipelago. The centering of a system of relations in Caribbean thought has been most significantly articulated by Eduardo Glissant in his books Poetics of Relation and Caribbean Discourse, which have shaped post-colonial discourse on the Caribbean. Glissant sought to position Caribbean identity outside of the scope of the colonizer and its historicity by asserting the right to opacity, that of being impenetrable to the domination of transparency that seeks to render everyone legible, and that encourages imitation in favor of cultural homogenization. Glissant's opacity refers to the complex makeup of the self, the interiority that constitutes identity, which is exuded and felt in the world, and the essence that sparks connection and forges relation. In other words, he argues that we don't need to understand each other fundamentally to embrace the complexity of the other. Admittedly, Glissant did not use the notion of whiteness or the white gaze, but he was clear about how colonialization, and I quote him here, understanding cultures then became more gratifying than discovering new lands. Western ethnography was structured on this need, but we shall perhaps see that the verb to understand, in the sense of to grasp, comprendre in French, has a fearsome repressive meaning here. End of quote. Glissant's writing uprooted identity from the colonizer's imaginary and allow it to have a kaleidoscopic uniqueness that could take up space in the world without any obligation to be fixed, defined, or understood universally. The imperial pervasiveness of the rational voice, that of the West, was deemed unequipped to acknowledge the multiplicity of the self and its expression. Hence, embracing our inscrutability is an expression of freedom, which ultimately forges what he calls relation. For Glissant, this relation was undoubtedly pronounced in the Caribbean, and I quote, "The Caribbean, as far as I'm concerned, may be held up as one of the places in the world where relation presents itself most visibly, one of the explosive regions where it seems to be gathering strength. This has always been a place of encounter and convenience, and at the same time a passageway towards the American continent," end of quote. Glissant's articulation made me think about the expression of multiplicity, its manifestation in Caribbean life, and how it is experienced and perceived. If opacity is the outcome of creolization, which came to be through imperial violence, then one can expect that the aesthetics of opacity are everywhere in the Caribbean. What I'm most curious about is how these aesthetics operate when confronted with violence, a force that, after all, is part of the genesis of the Caribbean. There are echoes of poetics of relation in the repeating island, Benitez Rojo's meta-archipelago, and what he refers to a certain kind of way, alludes to Glissant's systems of relations and opacity, respectively. Benitez Rojo deems the Caribbean a meta-archipelago, I'm quoting here, a machine whose flux, whose noise, whose presence covers the map of the world's history's contingencies. Through the great changes in economic discourse, to the vast coalitions of races and cultures that humankind has seen, end of quote. He starts a reading of the apocalyptic machine set in motion by colonizing forces as a way to arrive at a second reading that deals with a different kind of machine, the Caribbean that we see and feel nowadays. This constellation of islands is a place of performance, a rhythm made of percussion, a sea ritual enacted over and over again that confounds and pacifies. Benitez Rojo calls this performance a certain kind of way, cierta manera. For him, this certain kind of way defies description, so he illustrates it through a childhood memory of a time where fear of nuclear destruction consumed the world. Sitting at home as a little kid, as the television news bellowed in the background, he saw beneath his balcony 2 black women passing in a certain kind of way. And this is how he recounts that. A kind of Asian and golden power between their gnarled legs, a scent of basil and mint in their dress, a symbolic ritual wisdom in their gesture and their gay chatter. I knew then at once that there will be no apocalypse. The swords of the archangels and the beasts and the trumpets and the breaking of the last seal were not going to come, for the simple reason that the Caribbean is not an apocalyptic world, end of quote. We shall see. In this cierta manera, or certain kind of way, there is a transference between performer and the onlooker, which I'm interested in looking at in this essay, of a desire to neutralize violence by conjuring a poetic space that refers to the transhistorical codes of nature. Meaning that performing a cierta manera is a way of claiming one's obscurity, a multiplicity to open a portal through which the performer and the observer can slip in to suspend violence. This phenomenon manifests through a system of improvisation and an ensemble of signs, dance, music, language, literature, gesture, etc., that invoke poetics and an aesthetic of pleasure, liberation, and abundance. I must be clear here that by no means do I wish to consecrate the Caribbean, for it is also a place where the moral elements of colonization are being reproduced in aggressive forms against women, LGBTQ+, and Black people. A very real kind of violence that must be eradicated. What I want to point out here is that this certain kind of way, a phrase that I cannot begin to describe what it seeks to highlight, is not readily apparent because it is always improvised. of the moment and always in movement in the social drama of the Caribbean basin. The Caribbean is deemed as a technological poetic machine by Antonio Benitez Rojo as a way to claim the liquidity of this net that is always becoming and whose rhythm does not need sonic representation in order to be heard because it is felt. This machine of opacity cannot be mapped, capture, or anchor, for it is embodied and meant to be swum in. What I'm working out here is how this certain kind of way manifests in the socio-political realm through performances that center poetics and aesthetics of desire and pleasure in the face of state violence. For weeks in July 2019, thousands of people gathered in protest in the capital streets of Puerto Rico after years of disillusionment and frustration with the government. After the economic crisis in 2015, heralded by a debt that proved unpayable, caused by financial mismanagement, and two destructive hurricanes in the fall of 2017, Irma and Maria, that decimated an aged, neglected power system that left most of the island without electricity and clear water for months, in some areas for years. There was the certainty that government officials were not only incompetent, but not working in the best interests of its citizens. The estimate is that 4,645 deaths were caused by Hurricane Maria, and Puerto Ricans largely blame the government because of its inability to provide necessary aid for its citizens during these dire times. The tipping point was when two former top members of the Ricardo Rosselló government were arrested on federal corruption charges, and soon after, the controversy grew with the leaking of online chat conversations between Governor Rosselló, 10 government officials, and a publicist friend, all men. The exchanges were plugged with homophobic, ableist, and sexist comments that also detailed plans to control the media while creating a smear campaign against their political opponents. And to add insult to injury, they made mocking remarks about hurricane victims. The country was grieving and people were fed up. Puerto Ricans from all demographics came out with their unequivocal force to the streets of San Juan to demand that Rosselló step down in increasingly inventive and creative ways. They demonstrated on horses, bicycles, motorcycles, jet skis, kayaks, yoga mats, and while scuba diving, doing acrobatics, and banning pots. I'm gonna quote here Veronica Davila and Marisol Lebron, an article they published on this. Yet it was the young people dancing provocantly on the steps of the oldest cathedral in the New World to the boom shakawaka of reggaeton beats that may have finally forced Rosselló out of office. This perreo combativo, as dubbed by queers, trans, and non-binary youth, used perreo reggaeton style to create a sensuous, liberated, communal space that generated political power. End of quote. The streets of San Juan were flooded with people ready to express their anger and indignity, but their ways were exuberant, performances that confronted and challenged the status quo. They took a private experience and brought it into the public sphere to forge unity that was not only fueled by frustration, but also by joyous self-expression. Perreo, a sensuous, pelvic center and woman-led dance that can be danced with a partner or in groups, became a resource of revolutionary action and an alluring mechanism where the buoyant self could challenge structures of power. In truth, perreo and reggaeton have always been part of the political sphere, and they have a history of vilification. On the one hand, there is the criminalization of underground rap and the association of reggaeton with cafres, an insult with a racist history used against dark-skinned, lower-class people. And on the other hand, perreo has been deemed as a dance for loose women. As people twerk in the streets and plazas of old San Juan, they generated an erotic space, publicly pushing against patriarchal structures of oppression that seek to disable the power found in our deepest self. Audre Lorde, in Uses of the Rhetoric, let us know that the erotic has long been relegated to the bed because of the fear that emanates from the knowledge that the erotic brings about an internal satisfaction. And if allowed to permeate all aspects of life, we may be able to recognize that the power of the erotic, I'm quoting her here, can give us the energy to pursue genuine change within our world. End of quote. This spirit of reverie galvanized a resistance movement that compelled Rosario to resign from office soon after. Puerto Ricans were empowered to embrace their idiosyncratic selves and to conjure a place where the aesthetics of desire and pleasure prevail in defiance of the political system, and ultimately oust those in power that have enacted violence. About this, Benitez Rojo tells us that Caribbean people's aesthetics experience occurs within the framework of rituals and representations of a collective, ahistorical, and improvisatory nature, end of quote. The Caribbean came to be through a turbulent movement, and it is still on the move, fugitive here and there, and constantly enduring the wake of colonization. But we also must consider that it has conditioned Caribbean people to assist with an apolar rhythm where poetics shape the everyday. The Caribbean manifests because it refuses definition and synthesization. It is an archipelago en despliegue, reaching far from the limits of its sea. I wonder if what I felt when listening from a distance to those two Puerto Ricans stuck in that cantadito way is that inscrutability, esa cierta manera, that can diffuse even a lousy, dimly lit street on a cold night on the other side of the world. That's it from me. I really encourage you to visit the Monday Journal's website to read the rest of the essays in this publication, on this edition of the Monday Journal, edited by Danny Giles. Some other writers here are Angeline Morrison, Christine Golding, Nana Adusei-Poku, Sampada Arranque, a few Chicagoans here, Risa Puleo and Tomashi Jackson in a conversation, Gordon Hall, former Chicagoan, Latham Surfos and Ruby T. Yeah, that's it from me today. Thank you, Eduardo, again and to the Experimental Sound Studio in Chicago for inviting me here today. And yes, please go donate to the Chicago Freedom School, worthy and great organization, and follow them because they are really at the forefront of a lot of the protests and the kind of work that is being made right now, that is being done in Chicago. So yeah, thank you for tuning in. I give it away to the next person who's after me.